As we learned in our previous video, typesetting in After Effects follows the same format as that in programs such as Photoshop, Illustrator, or InDesign. In addition to animating text layers, however, in this program, the way we would animate any layer through its regular properties, we also have the ability to dig in and animate all the way to the character level through something called animators. Text animators are unique to After Effects, and they definitely can make your animations way more dynamic. So let's take a look and see how we access these animators. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new text layer in this composition by going under, right-clicking on the timeline and going under the new flyout menu and clicking on text. Now there I am going to type a sentence, and I am just going to click on to select the direct selection tool. So now with that done, this text can be affected by a set of properties that we have already by default with any layer under the transformation settings. And we can change things such as opacity and rotation and so on. So we know how to do this. Now, where the text engine becomes powerful is when we have the ability to add these animators under that layer. So under the text drop-down menu, you'll notice that you have something called animate to the right-hand side of the label text. And that's where all the animators for that particular text layer are found. So if I go ahead and click on that flyout menu, I have a whole new setting of transformations that I can affect into that particular layer, which means I can add extra versions of the regular transformations. You see that they are basically the same transformations that you've seen before, anchor point, position, and so on, besides new ones such as fill color, stroke. And the beautiful thing about these transformations is that they can be keyframed independently. So that means that I can create settings for these transformations in here besides the transformations that I have out here at the layer level. So how does this work? Well, let's go ahead and apply, for example, an opacity animator to this layer, to this text. Now you'll notice that with the transformation animator, I can go ahead and turn off the visibility of the entire layer. We expect that to happen because that's how the animator works for the layer. I mean, the transform, that property for the actual layer. Now this opacity animator, and by the way, when I clicked animator opacity, when I went animate opacity, I went ahead and added a new animator to the layer. You see it appear here. And it came with two options inside it. One is called the range selector, and the other one is called opacity, which is what I added. Now, the opacity works the exact same way as the opacity under my transformation tools, under my transformation properties. However, this opacity animator is tagged, or it is constrained by this item called the range selector. Think of the range selector as a parenthesis that determines where the transformation starts and where it ends with relation to the content of the actual text layer. So what does that mean? Well, let's go ahead and uncollapse that range selector, and you'll see the contents inside it. It tells you where the change, in this case opacity, starts, where it ends based on the percentage of the content inside that particular layer. And then it tells you, it gives you the ability to offset the two values. Offset basically means how much do you move from one point to the other. So say, for example, if I were to start at 50% and end at 100%, I could offset about 50% percentage value between those two values. So that gives you the ability to move things around. What does that mean? Well, let's go ahead and set my opacity to 0%. That's what I'm going to do. No keyframes. I'm simply going to set it to 0%. Now, I can change where the beginning point of that opacity at 0% starts based on the percentage that I increase or decrease on that particular start value. So you'll notice that right now I am at 66%. So I'm telling the layer, your opacity will be 0 starting at 66% and ending at 100%. If I bring the 100% down, then you see that I am telling it to stop at around 84%. So I have the ability to change those values based on the start and ending points of my range selector. The range selector is indicated by these lines with the little arrow that you see appear as I move the start and ending points. Now, the offset allows me to move that range selector on the text to a different location if that's what my intent is. If I want to do that, I can move that around to create, a specific animation that I'm targeting. Let me reset that and let me go back to endpoint at 100%. And I'm going to start my value at 0%. I'm going to set a keyframe at that point. I am going to go to the 1 second mark, and I am going to increase this to 100%. So in 1 second, my text is going to be revealed. Let's play that back, and you'll notice that each character fades in, which is what I expect based on the setting that I changed with my range selector. Now, this is fine. This works well, but what if I want to, instead of having the text semi-fade like this, I want it to appear as if it was being typewritten on the screen, sort of like when you see characters appear on a screen when someone is typing in a computer. So how do I go about changing that? Well, under the range selector, I also have these advanced options. And the advanced options give me the ability to control how that range selector affects the characters based on the change that I am applying on that particular set of characters. So for example, I can change, instead of saying based on characters, I want to change it to words. So as you'll notice, each word is actually fading in now. What if I want to do lines? Well, since this is only one line will fade in between those two keyframes. But if I had other lines underneath it, each line would appear one at a time. Now let's go back to characters really quick. And what if I don't want to fade in? What if I want to have it like it appears? Well, that is based on this value called smoothness. So if I bring the smoothness down to 0, now each character will basically appear as if it was being typewritten. And this is how you create an animation of something that is typewritten on the screen. So this is a very fast way to actually set typesetting like this, to actually titles to appear as if they have been typewritten. Now, let's go ahead and bring that smoothness back up again to 100%. And you have other options such as how much do you want this to affect the actual value of what you're working on, such as the amount, the mode, whether you want to change this from adding to subtracting and so on, depending on how you have layers interacting with one another, easies. So you have all these you have a randomizer as well. So you can actually turn that off, and you'll see that different characters appear at different times. So you have the ability to work with all of these different options under the Advanced tab for the range selector. Now, this works fine. This is good, and I can see a lot of possibilities to work with this. Where this gets interesting is where you can go ahead and start adding new animators. So you don't have to have just one animator. You can actually have more animators if you want to add extra animators. So for example, actually before I do that, notice that under the animator, I also have an add button. And if you click on that flyout menu, you have the ability to call more values to animate within that specific animator. So remember, the range selector tells you what is affected or not affected within the text layer. So the range selector gives you those characters. It gives you the little line, the parentheses that tells you this is the area that is being affected by the animator from this line to this line. And you can keyframe that, as you can see here, with the start and end points. Now, what if, for example, besides having this fade in like that, one character at a time, I also wanted to use the exact same range selector so that each character is sort of popping up, almost like it's scaling up into existence. Well, let's go ahead and from the add menu under that animator 1, go ahead and add a value for, say, scale. So you'll notice now that each one has a scaling value that appears. Now, you'll see now that scale is available to us right above opacity up here under that animator 1. So if I collapse animator 1, I see that I now have, let me collapse the range selector, I see that I now have scale and opacity controlled by that range selector. So I can go ahead and increase or decrease the values of these things through the scaling properties. So let me go ahead and set a scaling value of 0 at the beginning and a scaling value of 100 at the end. And see what that gives us. You'll notice that each one of these characters is appearing on the screen. Let me increase the size, and you'll notice that this is where the text engine is very dynamic. I can go in and change the actual properties of each character under the character tab and my animation remains. And you'll notice now that each character is increasing in size at the same time that the range selector, it is changing the opacity of that particular character. So it's extremely powerful. I mean, you can add animators, you can add more animators under that range selector if you want to. You can go in and say, okay, what about if I want each one of these to actually show from like the top, like they're dropping in? Well, let's change position values. So I can go ahead and say I want my position values to be where they are right now at the end of the composition. And at the beginning of the composition, I want them to be somewhere on the negative area here so that they're almost like dropping down like so. Maybe I want them to go even higher. Let me see if I can present. I can use those little X's. That's where the actual anchor point for each one of the characters is. So I can actually move that all the way until they're out of my composition, and you'll notice that each one of them is sort of falling into place as they're increasing in size and fading in. Once I combine this with, say, for example, the motion blur option under my layer, now I'm seeing that I get this very dynamic animation with very few keyframes and just literally just, why do I have an extra keyframe here? That's weird. Very few keyframes, and the engine is rendering fairly fast. So that is extremely powerful. Know that then that basically the combination is the animator, and every animator can have any of the values that you add under that animator, whether they're properties or any of the things that appear here or selectors are controlled by that range selector under, and you'll notice that they're under the properties appear under that range selector inside the animator. However, let me deselect everything by clicking out here on the gray area. If I go under the animate, the main animate at the top, and I say, let's say, for example, I also want rotation values for this, you will notice that when I click on that, I get me a new range selector under animator. And I can go ahead and animator too. And so I can now affect each character independently with a separate animator. So for example, everything right now is animating from 0 to 1 seconds under that animator. Let's say I want to start making each character rotate one rotation at the 15-second mark. So let me set a keyframe for this new animator with a value of 0 and then a value of 1 at the 1-second mark. My characters will come in one at a time, and when I hit the 15-frame mark, they should start rotating one at a time. What if I don't want to start rotating them but until that point with the range selector? Well, it is a completely separate range selector for that second animator. So I can go under that animator and say I want this to start at this point, and let's say I want it to go all the way to 100%. And so as you see, the previous ones, I started rotating backwards. So actually, let me go ahead and do this in reverse. Let me start at 100% and go 0 and see what that does. And if that's not what you want, let's go ahead and turn off the rotation values for all of those. And let's do it with the end values. So I'll start my end point at 0, which is probably what you would want to see, and did this at 100%. So my text comes in and starts rotating first character, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and so on. And this rotation value is smoothed out as well, just like the other one was. So if I uncollapse the range selector and I go to this, I can reduce the smoothness so that I can have the thing almost look like it's jumpy, one character at a time. So it gives you a lot of flexibility to have more than one animator, and inside each animator to have its own set of transformations controlled by each range selector independently. You also have other range selector options. By the way, if I want to, let's say, for example, I don't want this range selection anymore. This is not doing it for me. Can I go ahead and turn it off? And the answer is yes. You can go ahead and turn off the visibility for the animator, and it will not affect your layer by clicking on the little I. But if you really want to get away, do away with it, select the actual animator label and hit the delete key on the keyboard, and that removes the animator altogether. If you might get confused by having so many animators set up, you might want to just delete the ones that you don't need to have when you're working. Now, let's say, for example, what are those other range things that I saw in there? So if I go under the range selector, and if I click over here on the animator one, sorry, and I go and add a new wiggly selector, watch what happens. My text wiggles as it comes in. So it gives a wiggler value controlled by the range selector. And actually, this one has its own settings. This not by the range selector, controlled by the wiggly selector is what I meant to say. And it has its own set of properties that you can go ahead and change. So you can go ahead and say, change, instead of characters, change words. And so each word will be affected independently. Each word will wiggle. Or you can go ahead and say, okay, I want this to be how many wiggles per second? Let's say I want this to be really grungy. So if I want this to have like 10 wiggles per second, it's going to be moving them like it's jumpy a lot. Okay. So, I mean, there's a ton of different options that you can work with from within those selectors under the advanced tabs. Now, for the wiggly selector, there's no advanced tab. They're all available to you as soon as you uncollapse that wiggly selector. For the range selector, they would be under the advanced option, and that's where you find all the stuff that we worked with a second ago. So this is a short introduction to animators. Know that the key thing to understand in this video is that the animator is controlled by the range selector. What is control is the properties that you add through that when you first start the animator, and or by the any other sub properties that you add under each one of the animators separately. Before we go, there's another thing that I would like to show you, and that is, let me go ahead and remove that animator, those animators from here. Let me go ahead and select that animator and delete it, and so we go back to having nothing on the actual text, no animation. You will notice that, let me switch this workspace to my standard. And under the standard, I have my effects and presets option. Now, the presets are basically preset animations that come already set up for you under the program. These are by no means the end of the road for animation. What I mean by that is, when you use these presets, they are set for you so that you can start working from them, saving you some steps on the buildup. Do not just simply drop one of these presets onto the text and call it a day, because they won't look good. So, but they give you the ability to start working now that you understand how the animators work and the range selectors. So for example, let's say I want to animate this text and I want to choose animate in. And from the animate in, with the layer selected and the time marker right where I want to start this animation, which is at the beginning, make sure that you place the time marker where you want what you're about to do to start. Let's say I want to drop in by character. So if I drag that onto the text or onto the layer, or double click it here with the layer selected, if I double click it, it applies it, and you can see that I have range selection in there. Let's say, for example, let's go ahead and drop this in. Boom. And you'll notice now that everything gets moved in. You see the handles on the side, and you'll notice that the range selector is moving from beginning to end. If I uncollapse my text layer, you'll notice that I have an animator in there that was applied, and with a position setting. So I have the ability to start from the particular presets that are given to me by the program, and actually start modifying those to create exactly what my project requires, giving you basically a couple of steps, push ahead before you actually start working on your final projects.